All right, welcome everyone to another session, an exceptional lunch session of the Philosophy of Religions workshop. Please silence your noise makers. Any indicator of making noise. Something up here is making noise.
Yeah.
Did you guys hear that? That's going to be really annoying. Just a little kid in the pants. So I'm Neil Mundra, the outgoing coordinator of the Philosophy of Religions workshop. And I'm really thrilled today to hold what I really see as the capstone event of this year's discussions in the Philosophy of Religions workshop, which we've loosely organized around the theme of comparison, whatever that might mean. Comparison is a law, it's an
Have your phone.
It is my that's the engineering background. So the issue of comparison is an old ambivalence. One has a fraught history in religious studies, in the reception of non-Western philosophy into in Western philosophical circles. It remains controversial today, I would say, but exactly for these reasons, I thought it was really important to have a year of thinking about some of those issues. And there's really no better way to bring a close to this year of discussions than bringing our speaker today. I think it's fairly uncontroversial that if there's anything that legitimately can be called comparative work in philosophy and should have a place in contemporary philosophy, our guest today is really if not the leading practitioner of it. Professor Jonardon Ganeri is fairly recently Global Network Professor of Philosophy at NYU, appropriately shuttling around its various international campuses. And the fact that a department like NYU, which NYU's philosophy department is really, it's considered if not the best philosophy department in the country. It's very mainstream in general. It tends to do really, straight ahead analytical work. And the fact that they have seen fit to take on someone whose work crosses the usual boundaries and is very largely focused on Indian materials is really a testament to the importance and the quality of Professor Ganeri's work, and signals, I think, a very good, I'm hoping a very bright future for this kind of work. It is hopefully really a harbinger of good things to come. So, without further ado, it's really my great pleasure to finally bring Professor Jonardon Ganeri back to Swift Hall. So I'll give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Daniel, for such a generous introduction. It's great to be here. My talk is going to be entitled Why Philosophy Must Go Global, which is something I've been thinking a lot, precisely because I've just joined NYU. It's going to be, I'm going to talk generally about philosophy, but I think that everything I say applies to the philosophy of religion as well. So although it's a philosophy of religion workshop, I think everything I say will apply to methodology and philosophy of religion. Now, John Dewey, the great American educationalist, called the last lecture he delivered to his graduate students the idea of pluralism. In that lecture, which was subsequently published in his Dictionary of Education, Dewey said the following. He said, "What philosophers have got to do is to work out a fresh analysis of the relation between the one and the many. Our shrinking world presents that issue today in 1,000 different forms. Pluralism is the greatest philosophical idea of our times. How are we going to make the most of the new values we set on variety, difference, and individuality? How are we going to realise their possibilities in every field? And at the same time, not sacrifice that plurality to the cooperation we need so much? How can we bring things together as we must without losing sight of plurality? Problem one of many. Now for Dewey, education has to do with the insightful reorganisation of experience. Yet the sources of experience are plural, and the challenge for education is to bring diverse sources of experience into cooperation without falling into either one of two traps. The two traps in question have recently been redescribed by Charles Taylor and Hubert Dreyfus, I'm not sure which, as follows. They say in their recent book, there are, they say, two powerful positions being defended today. Let's call them modern scientism on the one hand, and different branches of subjectivism and relativism on the other hand. For scientism, any questioning of the unique truth of modern science must be equivalent to a rejection of truth itself as a category. For Rorty and others, on the other hand, the only way to escape the imperialism of modern science is precisely to question this category of absolute truth. Or Taylor and Dreyfus in their book propose a third possibility. According to what they call plural realism, there may be multiple ways of interrogating reality, which nevertheless reveal truths that are independent of us. That is, truths that require us to revise and adjust our thinking to grasp them. That's a kind of the realist part of plural realism. And where all attempts fail to bring the different ways of interrogating reality into a single mode of questioning that yields a unified picture of theory. That's the plural part of it. Well, I believe that that the education of global citizens who can collaborate in a diverse spectrum of points of view distinct from their own, requires that a pluralism about epistemic cultures is written into the institutional fabric of philosophy. And in fact, I do see signs of this happening in the world of academic philosophy today. The indicators of this new trend, I think, include a heightened appreciation of the value of world philosophies, the internationalization of the student body, the philosophical pluralism which the interaction of migration and new global movements makes salient, growing concerns about diversity within a still too wide faculty body and curricular canon, and identification of a range of deep structural problems with the contemporary philosophical academy in its discursive, citational, refereeing and ranking practices. Well, you all know what I'm referring to. I think we're entering what we might call the age of re-emergence, a new era, the key features of which are as follows. First, philosophies from every region of the world, locally grounded in lived experience and reflection upon it, are finding new autonomous and authentic modes of articulation. Second, philosophical industry, leading behind a center-periphery model of production, is becoming polycentric. The philosophical world is returning to a plural and diverse network of productive sites. Third, Europe and the other colonial powers are being provincialized, no longer mandatory conversation partners or points of comparison, but rather unprivileged participants in global dialogue. And fourth, philosophers within the largely anglophone international academy are beginning to acknowledge their responsibility so to arrange international institutions as to enable wide and open participation. That is, acknowledge that their control over the academy is a fallout from colonialism rather than a reflection of intellectual superiority. Well, the precursor to this new era in the immediate post-colonial period was the movement of what's called comparative philosophy. And I thought I should say something about the motivations of comparative philosophy. Insofar as comparative philosophy is a branch of philosophy, reason must be instrumental in its pursuit, given that philosophy is the employment of the human capacity for reasoned thought to understand how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, to use Wilfred Sellers' famous formulation. I'm actually going to offer my own definition of philosophy a bit later. But comparative philosophy was first and foremost not so much a new philosophical method as an experiential heuristic introduced at a particular moment in world history as part of a global movement towards intellectual decolonization. The ambition of comparative philosophy was not so much to generate new philosophical insights as to protect thinkers in colonized countries from the particular form of intellectual servitude colonialism sought to impose on them. Recognition and integration were its leading motives. A first generation of philosophers still colonized, still living under colonial rule, seeking recognition for indigenous manners of understanding through the demonstration of their comparability with colonial insight. A second generation in the years after the end of colonial rule, hoping for assimilation and integration in an internationalized philosophical academy. Philosophers writing bravely against the grain in colonized societies or in the ferment of post-colonial nation-state formation made extraordinary progress in the rediscovery of lost philosophical inheritances and in the demonstration of their full entitlement to philosophical recognition. Yet colonizer philosophy remained in such endeavours a privileged mode of thought and a point of reference, if only as a focus of resistance. These projects aimed either to incorporate indigenous thinking into a still unchallenged colonial paradigm, or else to reverse colonial asymmetries while leaving a fundamentally colonial structure intact. Now, when in what I'm going to go on to say I refer to the colonial use of reason, I won't mean its use by the ancients or pre-moderns, but by those philosophical giants in the 18th and 19th centuries who provided colonialism with its moral and intellectual foundations. This colonial use of reason represented itself as impartial, objective, and universal, but in fact was anything but, and that was its first dishonesty. Its second was the way it defended its claims to impartiality and universality over and against competing claims from outside. It didn't engage in honest debate, philosopher to philosopher, but instead dismissed the alternative's claim to universality altogether. So colonizers took what was in fact itself a local way of using reason, one contextually entangled with the history of the colonial project, falsely promoted it as a uniquely acontextual methodology, and denied that outsiders had so much as a concept of the general application of reason on the grounds that they did not share its parochial epistemic practices. Excuse me. Colonial rationalists' false claim to neutrality catches the excluded outsider in a vicious dilemma. Make your reason like ours, in which case what extra value does your philosophy bring to the table? Or admit that you are outside reason and not actually engaged in philosophy at all. The dilemma is false because the neutrality of colonial reason it presupposes is a phony mixture of two myths. The first myth is that the colonial will to universality is impartial. The second myth is that the existence of the outsider's will to universality is to be denied. In denying outsiders a will to universality, the colonizer denied them their humanity, and the various ignominious philosophical rationalizations of colonial rule were but corollaries of this basic double move. Simone Weil would observe it in the intrinsic absurdity of children in French Polynesia being made to recite, "Our ancestors, the Gauls, had blonde hair and blue eyes," while forbidden their indigenous custom, language, and tradition, forbidden even access to the libraries containing documentation relating to it. The move is evident when a history of epistemology in the West describes itself simply as the history of epistemology, protest met with disinterest. So the colonial power has philosophy, the rest of the world has only what was described as culture, or more condescendingly, wisdom tradition. The colonizers claim that reason, meaning their specific and provincial use of reason, is a neutral tool. Had thus to be exposed as trickery, this a precondition for the intellectual colonization of the rest of the world, and the redressing of a blatant epistemic injustice was the ambition and project of comparative philosophy. So that was just a few remarks about the nature of comparative philosophy as a project. Now, philosophers in the age of re-emergence certainly are thinkers using reason to seek out new ways of understanding how things, including human beings, hang together. However, the uses they make of reason are markedly different from the way reason has been used and abused in colonial intellectual projects in Europe and elsewhere. Conscious by necessity of the colonizers' ways of doing philosophy, newly emergent thinkers are continuously on guard not to allow themselves to fall into the invidious dilemma described above. A re-emergent way of thinking must combine appeal to the indigenous with defensive dialectical skills. Non-Europeans had to turn themselves into Europeanists in order to figure out how to sidestep its enslavements. And the same is true of those who were at the mercy of other colonial powers. So philosophy in the age of re-emergence is thus not a matter of seeking the essence of autochthonous ways of thinking. And indeed, essentialism about philosophical traditions is but a modern strategy to cope with colonial guilt, resting in the vain hope that the colonized have not, after all, been deprived of intellectual integrity. But the once colonized don't have the luxury to practice philosophy in some state of philosophical innocence, and nor do they wish for it. For in this new era, every philosophical identity is hybrid and dynamic, crisscrossing multiple localities of geography and epoch. So such philosophers leave to philologists and text critical historians the attempt to construct an archaeology of past systems of thought, destined only to become specimens in a museum of ideas. For the once colonized always has to watch against being made into an ethnographic object. For them, the use of reason consists in the manner in which they inherit a past and transform it into an articulation of a lived experience. And in that very act of retrieval and reinvention, fashion a distinctive understanding of how it all hangs together and why. So when it is therefore asked, can Asians or can non-Europeans think? The answer is yes, of course. Must they think as if they are Europeans? No, because the fundamental asymmetry that colonialism produced cannot simply be made to disappear in an act of collective amnesia of the sort intellectuals of former colonial powers seem so remarkably adept. The cosmopolitanisms of re-emergence are subaltern and subversive interplays between a plurality of open vernaculars and new, non-coercive ways to think about our common humanity. Solidarity across borders among the once colonized leads to revitalizations in the understanding of those various inherited pasts, revitalizations that in turn deepen cosmopolitan awareness. And such a project indeed retrieves the cosmopolitan ideal from imperial misappropriation. Chris Manjapra has described this as an aspirational cosmopolitanism, meaning the pursuit of conversations across lines of difference between disparate socio-cultural, political and linguistic groups that provisionally create shared public worlds. Now, as philosophers in every linguistic and geographical region of the globe begin to re-emerge, so too do innovative ways to use reason. I'm going to give two examples of ways of using reasons that do not fall into the colonial model I've described. Excuse me. Here I'll appeal to India, the non-European philosophical world I know best. And world philosophers everywhere must retrieve from their own inheritances their own renewed ways to use reason. My studies of logical theory in India have led me to see that there's a fundamental contrast between two styles of reasoning, that of formal deduction on the one hand, and that of particularist, case-based, blueprint plus adaptation, extrapolation on the other. The latter model, whose origins in India lie as much in the ritual reasoning of the Mimamsa exegetes and the jurisprudence of the Dharma-shastra, as in explorations in the science of prediction in the medical treatises, and perhaps most especially in early Nyaya logic, developed into a general theory of ethical and normative reasoning. The basic idea is that an object is inferred to have one unobserved property on the grounds that it has another observed one. There's fire on the mountain because there's smoke there. The most distinctive aspect of the schema is the fundamental importance given to the citation of an example, a single case said either to be similar or else dissimilar to the topic at hand. Suppose I want to persuade you that it's about to rain, and that reason as follows. Look, it's going to rain. Foresee that large black cloud in the sky. Last time you saw a large black cloud like that one, what happened? Well, it's the same now. It's definitely going to rain. A 5-step inference pattern. What does it tell us about the nature of reason when particulars are in this way made to work as exemplary cases? First, that the methods of selection and adaptation are implied by the description of the particular. As a structured, complex whole, the particular is normative. It constrains what other particulars count as resembling it by sharing a common basic framework. And it constrains what modifications or substitutions are possible, thereby determining a method of adaptation. Like a curved object used as a benchmark, an exemplary case bends the ruler to fit itself. Second, the standards are context sensitive and localized because of the requirement that proper purpose is preserved, whether that be the matching of shapes of objects, or of performing rituals that have their intended effects, or of making accurate predictions. This implies that substitutions and comparisons remain close to the prototype, that the spread of standards of selection and adaptation is localized. So whether particulars are thought of as typical samples or as prototypical schemata, the standard is not absolute and universal, but localized, sensitive to context, and open-textured. The early Indian thinkers thus present an important style of thinking well, yet one that's not understood if we think of all good reasoning as involving subsumption under a general rule. Now, there is to give a second example of an acolonial use of reason, a kind of philosophy that consists in perspicuous ordering, staying on the surface, rendering evident the distinction between, on the one hand, generative explanations, the step-by-step reasoning of a philosophical deduction, and on the other, using insightful ordering and sparseness to put the phenomenon in question on display, has a strong parallel in the Indian mathematicians' discussion of a kind of mathematical proof, which they say aims at rendering the mathematical result transparent, rather than reaching it in a series of deductive steps. Bhaskara's diagrammatic proof of a theorem known from the Sulba Sutra is meant to display the theorem, not deduce it. A diagram is just a diagram, it doesn't in itself do anything. What does the proving is the viewer's moving triangles around in imagination to form two squares. And so, likewise, philosophy here occurs at the interface between text and reader, in the reader's acquisition of a clear perspective in the topology of concepts through their imaginative engagement with the text. One finds this method at work in the Indian philosophers who compose extremely compact texts written in short aphorism-like formulae, which aim more at conceptual cartography than at system building. Seeing interrelatedness is as creative a philosophical act as drawing consequences. We might say that one is a matter of evidence and the other of what is evident. The interrelations between the components of a complex theoretical structure can be explained, or at least explicated, by displaying their isomorphism with another structure, perhaps more familiar or antecedently better understood. So in this method, similes function as models. A clear map of the conceptual terrain is a powerful tool, enabling both creative thought and empathetic attention. And philosophy based on this second use of reason has not lost sight of its ties to deepened ways of living. In this use of reason, also the idea of omission plays an important role. For philosophers who use reason in this second way are careful to omit anything that can cloud the reader's capacity to form a picture. And a large part of philosophical skill is knowing what to ignore. So let me offer my own definition of philosophy then. I would say that what makes a practice philosophical is the use of distinctively human capacities to find orientation in the space of reasons. That is to say, to move from perplexity or samshaya to clarity or nirnaya. And that orientation can come either in the form of a reason's compass, which enables the activity of going step by step, engaging one's powers of deductive manoeuvring and capacities for projective extrapolation, or else in the form of a concept map, which engages the imagination and enables one to make a survey of the terrain, locating oneself within it. This conception of philosophy embodies a type of pluralist realism, a commitment to the claim that there are many ways to investigate a reality whose existence is independent of human inquirers, a plurality of ways of thinking that cannot be reduced to any one single mode of interrogation. Well, in my own work, I've sought to inhabit the elusive ground that respects this idea of epistemic pluralism, that doesn't fall either into a scientism or a form of subjectivism or relativism. I've investigated the plurality of classical Indian philosophical shastras, a shastra being not merely a systematic representation of a network of ideas, but a fluid disciplinary practice for the production of knowledge of a certain sort in a certain domain. They've been described as Sanskrit knowledge systems, and since their concern is not only with the manufacture of a body of belief, but also with how such beliefs are warranted, how beliefs are argued for, and what kinds of evidence can be provided, it seems entirely correct to describe them as epistemic cultures, in the sense of Karen Settina wrote a book by that title. And although the world of Sanskrit India supported a plurality of Sanskrit epistemic cultures, they did not exist in isolation from one another, but were in constant mutual dialogue and often very vociferous conflict. The Buddhists were not concerned only about the truth for Buddhists, but about the truth. And that's why Buddhists spared no intellectual energy in devising refutations of opponent views. The Vaisheshikas, the Nayakas, the Charvakas were concerned not only about the truth for Vaisheshikas, for Nayakas, for Charvakas, but engaged each other in philosophical argument, often of the highest order of sophistication and complexity. Disagreement of this sort implies a shared commitment to there being data that all can agree on. and that all can agree grounds claims to knowledge, and of there being mutually acknowledged instruments for the warranting of beliefs. There was precious little agreement about what that data is, or about the nature and proper characterization of the epistemic instruments. That is, about what the Indians call prameya and pramana. But there was agreement that there must be some correct characterization of both. The world of the classical Indian knowledge sciences, therefore, exemplifies a commitment to pluralism about epistemic cultures, combined with realism about the world that they discover. Now I want to say a little bit more about this concept of epistemic pluralism. And in fact, the nature of the epistemic pluralism on display has already been analysed for us, and by the Sanskrit tradition itself. The remarkable Jain philosophers make a distinction of fundamental epistemological significance when they say that as well as and in addition to pramanas, epistemic principles, there are also nayas, epistemic standpoints or stances, and that both are essential constituents in an epistemic culture. A naya is not a proposition, but a practical attitude, a strategy or a policy which guides inquiry. It's an approach to the problem of producing knowledge, not a thesis about the sources of justification. One such policy might be to attend only to what's immediately present in experience. Another might be to enumerate everything one encounters without making any categorical distinctions. Another to attend to stasis rather than flux, or vice versa. To see that stances are not propositions, we need only to reflect on the epistemic stance adopted by Nagarjuna, the Buddhist Madhyamaka, who denied that there is any way to say what nature is in itself, Svabhava. Nagarjuna was accused of refuting himself, for if his epistemic proposition is that everything is thus empty, then that proposition should be itself empty, i.e. without any meaning in itself. His response was that he held no proposition, that emptiness is not a proposition, and indeed that it would be a fatal error to mistake adopting emptiness as a philosophical position for belief in any philosophical proposition. And that answer might remind one immediately of Van Frassen's argument that, as a position in the philosophy of science, empiricism is not a proposition, for if it were, then since it claims that every thesis is open to empirical confirmation or disconfirmation, it itself, empiricism itself, would be open to empirical confirmation or disconfirmation. The idea is helpfully elaborated by Anjan Chakravarti, who says that a stance is a strategy or a combination of strategies for generating factual beliefs. A stance makes no claim about reality, at least directly. It's rather a sort of epistemic policy concerning which methodologies should be adopted in the generation of factual beliefs. Stances are not themselves propositional. They are guidelines for ways of acting. One does not believe a stance in the way one believes a fact. Rather, one commits to a stance or adopts it. So, for instance, physicalism is not so much a factual thesis, but a deference to the claims of basic science. Let me say then that a stance is a policy adopted towards the employment of epistemic principles. That seems to me to accord with one of the current notions of culture, the anthropological notion of culture, as a particular take on this ensemble of practices and preferences. So an epistemic culture is constituted by a stance. Now, pluralism in philosophy is a commitment to a pluralism about epistemic stances, and not to a pluralism about epistemic systems, especially not in the sense of Paul Boghossian, who argues against pluralism in his popular recent book, Fear of Knowledge. Some of you may have read it. Boghossian's argument against pluralism about epistemic systems is that if one of them is deemed to say something false, the other will be deemed to say something true. In those circumstances, it's hard to see how it could be right to say that there are no facts by virtue of which one epistemic system could be more correct than any other. But that argument doesn't apply to epistemic stances, for it is possible for there to be pairs of genuinely alternative epistemic stances, and no facts by virtue of which one is more correct than the other. We can see this most clearly if we remember that stances are action-guiding policies governing the application of epistemic principles. One might analogously think of a route as a guide to performing the action of reaching the summit of a mountain. There can be different routes up the mountain, perhaps with different benefits and drawbacks, but equally good for reaching the top. And here it would be absurd to say that deeming one of the approaches true necessarily means deeming the other false, because both truth and falsity are not the norms according to which plans for action are evaluated. And also because whatever that norm is, both approaches may satisfy it equally well. Or to give another example, it's often the case that a given mathematical theorem can be proved in two different ways, adopting in each case a different proof strategy, yet both equally correct, i.e. sound as proofs of the theorem in question. Now, a fundamental distinction emphasised by James, and this was their second great theoretical achievement, is a distinction between inclusive and dogmatic ways of adopting a stance. A stance is adopted inclusively if its adoption does not prohibit others' use of different stances. A stance is adopted dogmatically if its adoption does prohibit others' use of different stances. Someone assumes a stance dogmatically if they believe or expect or hope that in the context under consideration, the stance is susceptible to rational support of the kind that makes it uniquely defensible as opposed to its contraries. And it was, claimed James, the great failing of the traditional proponents of the Sanskrit philosophical systems that they invariably took a dogmatic approach to the epistemic stances they articulate. The importance of that distinction between the inclusive and dogmatic is now clear if we restrict our attention to stances adopted only dogmatically. Then a version of Boghossian's argument returns. For to adopt an epistemic stance dogmatically is to deem that its prescriptions for the use of the epistemic principles are correct and that any other prescription is faulty. So the giant distinction between principles and stances is enough to diffuse Boghossian's argument against epistemic pluralism. I've said that distinct stances may sometimes apply with equal correctness to an investigation. The giants argue that this doesn't entail that the distinct deliverances of stances are necessarily contradictory, rejecting the idea that things have a single unique essence. The Jains say instead, and this was their third great theoretical innovation, that reality is in some sense manifold or multifaceted. The Jain term is anakanta. Metaphysics tends to treat objects, qua targets of inquiry, as if they are simple points, like the peak of a mountain. Yet the mountain itself is metaphysically more complex, its variously shaped sides offering different aspects to the climber, and so different potential routes to the top. So to quote Siddhasena, the real thing whose essence is multiplex forms the domain of all acts of awareness. An object qualified by one facet is known as the province of a standpoint. And Siddharsi Ghani elaborates, adding that the real thing, both external and internal, endowed with a form that is under the sway of multiplex essential natures, not separate from each other, unfolds itself to all epistemic principles. Mountaineers, by whichever route they select, have the same tools and techniques available to them, the same ropes and the same clamps and things, but the mountain unfolds itself differently to each, and each aspect is thus presented has as much of a claim to be the essence of the mountain as any other. And likewise, each non-dogmatic epistemic stance is an approach to some one aspect of the world. Different stances are policies for warranting beliefs about different aspects of the world. That is, we might think that there are a plurality of special sciences, each special science having as its province some particular domain or level of properties, and no such domain being reducible to any other. To say this is to deny that there's any single way the world is in itself, that there is some uniquely objective description of the world viewed sub species aeternitatis, from nowhere. Rather, the multiplicity of different approaches collectively constitutes a view from everywhere. Well, I adopted this suggestion in my work on Sanskrit philosophical accounts of the nature of the self. The stance taken by the Nayakas is that mental states must be owned by a subject, where ownership consists in endorsing the belief, preference, commitment, or aspiration represented in the state. That is to say, the aspiration or whatever is made one's own. This stance is thus a normative approach to what's at stake in undertaking a first-person position. A quite different stance towards the human subject is taken by the Abhidharmika Buddhists, whose stance is instead perhaps phenomenological. The Buddhist investigation of the first-person position is conducted with an approach that emphasizes the analytical dissection of the phenomenological character of presented mental states, most especially states of attention and attachment. Are these two philosophical approaches in contradiction with each other? That was certainly the story of the intellectual rivalry between Nyaya and Buddhism throughout the first millennium, the result, say the Jains, of dogmatism on both sides. Yet we may instead take a more nuanced view of the multi-aspectual nature of human subjectivity. And what I've argued is that owning the mental state itself has several aspects, one of which is correctly explored by each of the two supposedly rival philosophical schools. We might agree to say that Buddhists and Nayakas employ different epistemic methodologies, as long as we're clear that this doesn't consist in the claim that they have rival conceptions of epistemic justification, only that their epistemic policies, approaches, cultures, and so on are distinct. It's just because mental ownership, the foundation of subjectivity, is multi-aspected that there can be different approaches to it, in much the same way that it's because objects have many properties that there can be different names with different senses for one and the same object. I'm getting towards the end of this talk now. So the epistemic pluralism I want to defend is not a pluralism about epistemic systems, but about epistemic stances, where a stance is a policy guiding the use of principles. While possibly there are pairs of genuinely alternative epistemic stances and no facts by virtue of which one is more correct than the other, that's the pluralism, this isn't necessarily so of every pair. And epistemic stances can be evaluated according to non-alethetic norms appropriate to them, and so they're partially ordered. A pluralism about epistemic cultures, practices, or stances is compatible with the idea that there's a single reality to be explored, a multi-aspectual, multi-dimensional, or multi-essenced one. And that's the lesson I've learned from my study of India's profound tradition of intellectual pluralism. And it's actually rather encouraging to me that contemporary thinkers, some through empirical analysis of actual scientific practices, like Karen Cetina, some through cross-cultural and historical explanations of the contrast between ancient Greece and ancient China, like G.R. Lloyd, and some through a philosophical wish to escape the horns of the oscillation between scientism and subjectivism, like Taylor and Dreyfus, have begun to converge on some version of exactly the solution first touted by the giants of India, namely that epistemic cultures are practical policies to be adopted, not sets of propositions to be believed, and that reality is manifold, so that no one philosophical culture can claim privileged access to nature as it is in itself. Well, let me conclude by tying this up with the first part of the talk. A pluralist approach to philosophy brings into view kinds of philosophical skill that are institutionally marginalised in the 19th century paradigms of education, the hallmarks of which include rigid disciplinary divisions, promotion of specialisation over expertise, ranking obsession, curricular conservatism, and so on. Philosophy in the academy, in departments structured around outmoded models of education, is at present too often institutionally blind to a great variety of encultured philosophical ability distributed throughout the decolonial world. New academic initiatives should engage these skills and bring them together to promote new kinds of philosophical creativity. If the two great functions of education are to educate how to be reflectively self-critical and to educate how to engage with other perspectives and points of view with empathy and openness, then pluralism about epistemic cultures should sit at the heart of educational policy making. What I've tried to do in this talk is to articulate the philosophical foundations of such a pluralism. All fields of inquiry are moving towards greater internationalization, and the principal effect of internationalization is that at many, perhaps most, locations of human habitation, a multiplicity of cultures will be present and accessible to the individuals living there. And the effect of that on the discipline of philosophy is certain to be profound. I've described techniques for the interrogation of reality that I discovered through commerce with Indian philosophical texts in Sanskrit, and I've given an indication of the styles of philosophical practice they sustain and their potential for contributing to a re-emergence of creative philosophy from this part of the decolonized world. Those who are immersed in philosophies from Africa, Asia, Mesoamerica, or Australasia will have their own contributions to make, and we may look to a future when there will be a vibrant pluralism in departments of academic philosophy around the globe, and indeed a new cartography of philosophy. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We will try to wrap up right around 1:20 so we can go to class after that. We just like every 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you so very much for your talk. I'll ask you, I guess, a simple question. So should philosophy go global, as you announced in the talk, on the justification of the Jaina epistemological system? Is it
should it go global?
Yeah. Well, my question is it you use the Jain epistemological system of Pramana and Nyayas to justify this globalization of philosophy, if I understood your talk right?
Yeah.
So outside of this particular Jain perspective, can we make an argument for the globalization of philosophy?
Well, my argument has been that we need certain distinctions which were first brought to epistemology by the Jains in order to defend the claim that a plurality of distinct philosophical traditions can all contribute to a single philosophical project.
Mm-hmm.
Without those distinctions, you could just say that philosophy should remain parochial and, that has no need to refer to other philosophical traditions other than the one it happens to work with.
So maybe let me specify my question.
Yeah.
What is it in the global pluralism that needs to appeal to, for example, the Nyaya epistemology to justify that philosophy department should open up? What is it particular about that plurality of world philosophy compared to the plurality of Western philosophy? I think that between Frege and Aristotle,
right,
or Plotinus and Rorty,
yeah,
there is as much plurality as there is between, let's say, Jane and Aristotle.
There is, within any philosophical tradition, there will be pluralism, and within the Western tradition, there is pluralism. And what we need is a kind of a theoretical model to understand the nature of that pluralism, because as you see in departments of philosophy, Western philosophy at present, there tends to be a refusal to acknowledge this pluralism and to specialise. And either the department is analytical, very analytically focused, or else it's focused on what's called the continental tradition. And there isn't much of an attempt to accommodate the pluralism even within Western philosophy. There isn't that much effort to do the history of philosophy and to look at the Arabic tradition, for example. There's very, very little effort on that part, and I think that so I think that the argument that I'm making applies is like a fractal argument, yeah, like applies all within individual traditions as well as cross traditions. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
And given the fragmentary nature of departments that you already mentioned, do you expect, say, global philosophy to become just one of the many? Aside from along continental, analytical, etc. Or you would hope for something more?
Yes, I think I'm hoping for something more. I'm hoping for the discipline, and for a change in the discipline of philosophy, for what it means for philosophy to be practiced. I think that it's not simply that we need to add further rooms in a house where nobody moves between the doors, the separating doors. We need to change the conception of philosophy, so it's not simply about exploring the conceptual terrain in the room you happen to occupy. So yeah, I mean, I don't think of global philosophy as just one more type of philosophy added to continental philosophy and analytical philosophy. Absolutely not.
Thanks for the talk. I'm inclined to share your sense that the Giants give us a good way to talk about philosophical diversity and make sense of it. And I heard in your rehearsal of that in response to PJ's question, echoes of Nicholas Rescher's book, The Strife of Systems, which also gives an account of why philosophical pluralism is as we should expect, why it says we should expect that there will be a plurality of perspectives, and why that nevertheless doesn't count as an argument for skepticism, why we shouldn't conclude from that we can't know much of anything. But I wonder how your invocation of the Giants escapes some of the kinds of critiques that you yourself have made. So you seem to represent the Giant idea of epistemic standpoints, not as sort of neutral with respect to the questions of adjudication. But the same kinds of questions about self-referential incoherence and whatnot that are pressed against relativists are pressed against the Giants too. So if the Giants say that, well, we can make sense of philosophical pluralism by recognizing that all the different conclusions of these schools of thought get something right. It's just that each of them is true only relative to a certain stance, which they've failed to make explicit. You can then ask the question of, is that claim about stances to be parameterized the same way? And if so, then is there no longer any reason to believe it? So I wonder how your appeal to the Jains is meant to work here. Does this amount? How do you avoid the thought that this amounts simply to picking a tradition within the Indian philosophical scene, the decolonized philosophical scene, and elevating it to the status of interpretive key for the whole conversation, other than by arguing that the Jains are right? Like, in which case you'd have to be doing metaphysics and epistemology and arguing not that they give us a sort of neutral framework, but that the Jains have the most nearly right philosophical account of the intrinsic complexity of things and the perspectival character of knowledge. And it's because they are right about the metaphysics and the epistemology that they give us the best key to philosophy, or to philosophical pluralism.
Yeah, well, I saw the kind of pluralism was offering a kind of a middle path between a kind of scientism and relativism, and so I definitely didn't want to kind of characterize the view as being that truth claims are made true with respect to stances. That would reduce the pluralism about epistemic stances to a form of relativism. So the thought wasn't that, and although the Jains have been interpreted that way, and have been, then that's those kind of relativistic interpretations of Jainism will then ensnare them in all the kinds of problems that you're rehearsing to do with the incoherence of a global relativism. But my idea was that we should see them as doing something different. We should see them as putting a new theoretical resource on the table in doing epistemology, and a very useful one. And this, the distinction between an epistemic principle, which is a kind of a general normative statement about justification, for example, that in normal lighting conditions I'm justified in believing what I see, for example, an example of an epistemic principle, which roughly corresponds to the idea of pramana. And on the other hand, this idea that there are practical policies involved in epistemology, and we need to kind of acknowledge that there are a plurality of different epistemic policies, but they don't. But generating knowledge using particular epistemic policy doesn't entail that the knowledge so generated is true only relative to that policy. That was the distinction I was hoping to rest on in order to avoid this. Otherwise, it would be a very serious objection. Okay, and then someone with that.
Yeah, you mentioned when you were talking about different approaches or nayas that there could be, for example, an emphasis on stasis, or there could be an emphasis on flux,
right,
and that these are different ways. But I'm struck also by the way that you began by talking about mathematics and then ended up talking about Jain views on dogmatism, and it strikes me that one thing that connects the mathematicians, for example, with other groups like the grammarians, is an emphasis on what you might call algorithms in operation,
right.
Leading to ever more accurate knowledge, as opposed to formulas, static formulas,
right,
which is basically the same distinction that's made recently by people like Stephen Wolfram in New Wave Science. If I understand you correctly, that this kind of family of views that's tied together by a kind of generative process is just one of these, is just one recognized type of Nyaya alongside, say, a Nyaya emphasis on examining static configurations. Is that accurate to say it that way?
Yeah. I mean, in the mathematical case, you might have very different proof strategies for proving a particular theorem, and one might be algebraic, and another might be algorithmic. But they both prove the same theorem. And to say that just because there's an algebraic proof of a theorem means that there can't be an algorithmic proof of the same theorem is dogmatism. Yeah.
Well, here I'm thinking also not just of, if you look at the mathematicians, for example, not just of proofs, but also of things like the generation of sign tables, and the goal of being able to do that through a process that's applied. And what's my point in this? That some people, I'm thinking here of Pingree, for example, have pointed to that as a characteristic Indian approach. So what I'm trying to get at is it one of many different Indian approaches, or is it something that really ties together the majority of?
I see.
Because it sounds as though you view it as being one among many, each of which have kind of equally useful followings. I'm also struck by the fact that if you focus on, say, the generation of sign tables as opposed to the proving of theorems, then it moves into a kind of anthropological area that's connected with the very first thing we talked about in talking about definitions of philosophy, is the connection of these processes with living life.
Yeah. So I mean, well, that would what you're saying would actually, I think, support my overall argument, because supposing it were true that you could make a general anthropological claim that Indians prefer kind of algorithmic methods of thinking, then insofar as there are other important ways of interrogating reality which are not algorithmic, then the Indian approaches need to be supplemented, and that would then precisely be why conversation between Indian and Chinese philosophers, for example, would be a valuable philosophical exercise to conduct, because of an incompleteness on both sides.
Right. And just one final thing. You also mentioned at the beginning kind of sutra style of having very concise. So you could view that as as an example of this kind of algorithmic generative model, that knowledge should somehow be able to unfold out of that. And that's something that the Naiyayikas make use of as well. But that would then be on par with the fact that grammarians or Vedantis end up making use of Navya techniques of description. And so that would be an example of the kind of cross-fertilization.
Right, yeah. No, that would be a very good example. Yeah. Yeah, and it all goes, the whole sutra thing goes back to harmony, of course. That's itself a generative model. And I think all the philosophical schools were trying to do for metaphysics and epistemology, what Harmony had done for grammar, so trying to construct, generative structures for the description of metaphysics or epistemology. There was a question back. Yeah.
So I think I'm very sympathetic to your claim that the idea that Western philosophy grows out, perhaps out of traditional colonialism, right, and that there's a kind of silencing, right, of other cultures, right, and the claim that they're not discussing philosophy in a way that uses reason, perhaps. So I was wondering, and I think there's definitely great insights to be drawn from these other traditions. Right, so I was sort of puzzled a little bit, but maybe I want you to elaborate more on the example that you gave about the possibility of having different epistemic practices or policies, right? So I take it, I think there's certain kinds of normative practical policies governing how we should come to have certain kinds of beliefs, right? And that it's important to recognize that there's many different standards, right, or different policies that we use. And I was wondering, well, that's something that Western philosophers are perfectly sympathetic to and have thought about, right? So I was wondering, maybe is there something specific about the way that Indian philosophers are thinking about this kind of issue, or maybe there's another kind of example that shows by how we can gain further insight into contemporary epistemology by examining Indian philosophy or some other kinds of philosophy that we're not familiar with that would be illuminating. I was wondering if you can elaborate more on that.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit like the the first horn of the dilemma that I set up. That as somebody who works on Indian philosophy, what you hear all the time is, whenever you present some piece of Indian theory, Western philosophers say, either we've got it already, there wasn't the point in learning Sanskrit when we've got it already and we can just read it, or else it's not really philosophy at all. It's some other weird stuff.
That kind of way. So I'm trying to, asking you for elaboration.
Yeah. Well, I think this whole kind of the kind of philosophical foundations of epistemic pluralism were indeed developed by the Jains to a far greater degree than any Western thinker had done. Rescher wrote a book, I have to look at that again, because that's a long time since I read it. But there's very little work on this kind of thing amongst Western epistemologists. There are many areas within epistemology where discussion could be advanced by looking at Indian theory. For example, the whole discussion of testimony, for example, really only took off. It's taken off in the last 20 years precisely because of an anthology published by Matilal and Chakravarti, documenting the Indian discussions debate. That got Western philosophers to start taking an interest in the epistemology of testimony. There are lots of areas. There are lots of discussions in epistemology at the moment to do with what's called, well, maybe it's, if you're an epistemologist, a subject-sensitive textualism.
Yeah.
And In fact, next week I'm going to a conference in Japan, which it's called ethno-epistemology. And the basic principle of this underlying assumption or idea behind this conference is that thinking about epistemology in languages other than English changes, the way that one perceives the epistemological landscape. And the English is actually not a very good language to do epistemology in. It's a very impoverished epistemic vocabulary. And so there'll be Japanese, obviously, and sinologists there, and other people, just showing how different epistemology looks when it's done in non-anglophone languages. So maybe you should come to it.
I just had a question about the use of the word philosophy itself in that law.
Right.
And one can actually wonder whether philosophy can itself ever be in a sense non-Greek. So
philosophy be non-Greek?
In the sense that, so one way of responding to that might be just that it doesn't matter what you call it, right? You might as well call it international and Dikshiki or something else, so long as the way that you've defined it, which is this movement from some shared Virginia, remains the same. But if that's how you were to define what you're calling philosophy, then I think a lot of activity that goes on, let's say the Indian context, probably might not count as philosophy at all, or even in the context of, let's say, continental philosophy. So the Indian context is, as you probably know, a lot of schools are actually very skeptical of reason itself as a reason-giving activity, and that it must somewhere be suspended for you to actually be talking about truth. And so you not only have the skepticism towards this obsession with giving reasons and evidence, but also that truth itself, whether that ought to be the primary motive and search for a philosopher. For instance, the way that, let's say, Heidegger himself talks about philosophy as having a certain experience with language and so on. So these are very non-epistemic models of what might count as doing philosophy. And I wonder whether those can be included in your model. Thank you very much.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that my concept of philosophy is too narrow, that it's excluding some intellectual practices that we should call philosophy, but when we fall into this, that definition. Yeah. I mean, I think that I think it's possible to characterize a general form of a generic kind of intellectual a genus of intellectual activity, of which philosophy, the philosopher tradition, the Greek, Arabic philosopher tradition is one species, and Vichyky is another species, and Dershner is another species, and there'll be lots of other species as well. And so it's not. So then you avoid all the kind of sterile conversations about whether Vichyky is a translation of philosophy, and those kinds of things. But it will exclude some. There will be perfectly legitimate intellectual practices that we won't want to call philosophy, or a common specific of philosophy. And I don't think we should make philosophy into an all-embrace. I mean, I know that in India people, philosophy is a term of prestige, and so everyone wants to call themselves a philosopher. But there's no harm in saying that there are intellectual practices, perfectly legitimate ones, but they're not philosophy, they're something else. I mean, for example, it used to be the case that any discussion of Indian materials to do with philosophy or religion or theology was all called Indian philosophy. And that, a more recent movement has been to say that we can talk perfectly legitimately about Indian theology. We don't have to use the word philosophy to kind of add some kind of legitimization of this discipline. So we can talk about Shankara, for example, as a theologian. It's not a problem. That's not undermining his intellectual, magnificence. But we don't need to use the word philosophy as the only term of appraising. I'm not sure if I quite answered your question.
Yeah, it kind of seems to me that even this global philosophy has certain very deeply rested notions of what counts as philosophically important and just moved in history.
Yeah.
To the certain epistemological term that philosophy is taken. But that's how philosophy is also getting deeper.
Yeah. Well, epistemology was very important in India as well. You can't be denied. The whole Pramana tradition is extremely important. And even those who critiqued its foundations were belonged to that tradition of intellectual inquiry.
One last quick comment, Alexander.
You said that we can perfectly be justified in describing Shankara as a theologian rather than a philosopher.
Right.
But then I'm wondering, given that they in India were sort of inhabiting a single intellectual space and talked among each other, right? So is our classification of philosophers versus theologians again casting a colonial perspective?
Yeah. Well, the moment in the modern university is divided up according to certain disciplinary lines. That has to, I did actually go to a university in Kerala where there was a department of Nyaya and a department of Vedanta, which is rather wonderful. But my project isn't so radical that we should just abandon all the inherited disciplinary framework that we've got. It's rather to improve the situation as it stands within philosophy departments. So I'm not totally utopian.
Okay, we have got to end there. Before completely ending, let me just say that it's not all over yet. We have 2 more events in the Philosophy Religions Workshop this quarter. One next Thursday, the 26th at 4:30 p.m. One of our faculty sponsors, Ryan Coyne, will be discussing his book on Heidegger and Augustine, Heidegger's Confessions, I think it's called, in conversation with Professor Jean-Luc Marion. So that will be a very good conversation that will happen. And then the following week, Tuesday the 31st, also at 4:30, I think, we'll have our last student presentation of the year, theology student Hector Varela Rios. We'll be talking about race, fame, what's a thing. So that should also be very useful. And then we're done. So please stay tuned. Watch the newsletters wherever you found out about this. If you want to get on our mailing list, please come talk to me if you're not already. And there we are. Before we go, let's just please give one more warm round of applause for Professor Jonardon Ganeri.